I'd like to open it up to some questions from the audience. We have one that I find interesting. The typology of policymakers sounds interesting, but how can we operationalize the types? This is a question for Professor Jan. If some structural data for this variable is obtainable, this might lead to quite interesting research. Professor Kirshner hasn't really talked about types or, studying leaders. So I'm just wondering what both your take on this is. First, Professor Jan, but really quickly, and then I'd like to hear from Professor Kirshner again about this, whether he thinks that's feasible.
Okay. Leadership becomes leadership matters has already witnessed a lot of articles with this title. And actually, why suddenly people emphasize the leadership? And directly it's kicked off by the Trump's leadership. And people suddenly find that, hey, wait a minute, the democratic institution in the US, why these institutions can no longer control the Trump, cannot make him behave like the previous leaders. So that's why US is a superpower. When US, the leadership, changes its type, then it makes the global order change. So now people worry about the international order, the trend of international order, and everyone understands that the trend of the order was decided by the policy adopted by the major policy leaders. What kind of a policy they adopt? At least now we observe that they prefer, all of them prefer the populist policy, and they prefer deglobalization. All of them prefer to adopt a kind of isolationism or protectionism. The important thing is that even EU is the main engine of globalization. But now the EU make the final decision March of the last year, and then they will shorten or reduce international integration with the rest of the world in 5 fields: the food and technology, material, and digital, and data. So if the EU even prefer this protectionism, the policy makers of the EU prefer deglobalization. How can you accept the world order back to the globalization?
Thank you. And that seems to me to be, one of the most challenging developments going on in today's world, actually, that rather than talking and, becoming more global and, being interconnected, we are becoming isolationists again. Anyway, I don't want to monopolize. Professor Kirshner.
Very briefly, because on questions of leadership, I would defer to Professor Yan, but I would say that classical realism holds the view that leadership matters and diplomacy matters. I don't know if we have generalized theories about it, but I would always engage in this counterfactual exercise, which is if you change the leader or change the diplomat, would you change the outcome? And I think we can point to moments in history in which that was true. My personal favorite is the Falklands War. I don't think if Thatcher had not been prime minister, all the plausible alternatives, either within her leadership community or within the opposition party, I don't think any of them would have fought the Falklands War. And so if we want to understand why the Falklands War was fought and how it was fought, in that particular instance, at least, we're required to reach for the variable of leadership mattering. And I do think, again, leadership and diplomacy mattering is explicitly forbidden by a structural realist approach.
Great. I'll just read one more question. Is classical realism a more dynamic theory than structural realism, paying more attention to trends and future dynamic? In other words, can it be considered that Mearsheimer-style structural realism believes that China will inevitably become a military threat and the United States must respond at the military level, while Kennan-style classical realism believes that the United States asymmetric competition comparing the military threat from the Soviet Union, which not only focus on military and security aspect, but also focus on future economic development. So is it a dynamic theory that can take into account everything that we've just talked about?
There's a lot going on in that question. And so I will try and unpack some aspects of it. structural realist theories can be static or dynamic. So if you're looking at the balance of power alone, that's really a static systemic theory. If you're looking at changes to the balance of power, that's a dynamic theory. And as Jack talked about, I'm greatly influenced by Bob Gilpin, who was presenting largely a dynamic systemic theory. I do think that classical realism tends to emphasize dynamics over statics, meaning I think it tends to place a greater emphasis on changes to the balance of power than the distribution of power itself. But again, I think it parts company with a narrowly systemic theory in insisting that only looking at the system itself would be underdefined and that we need to bring in more variables in order to explain what's going on. I do want to also acknowledge the shout out to Kennan, another important classical realist, but I want to focus it on US-China relations because Mearsheimer's analysis of the US-China political rivalry focuses very much on the military side, whereas then classical realism and Kennan in particular tended to put an enormous emphasis on politics. And so again, there's a distinction between what classical realism would prescribe, and I'm cautious about saying that, and what a theory of offensive realism would prescribe, because classical realism is cautious about prescription. It would be to emphasize measures that were designed to shape politics. So again, Kennan was concerned about the political domination of states and how it might affect the balance of power. And so his concern for the future of the trajectory of power politics in East Asia would really have to do with the distribution of political influence more than necessarily counting the tanks and troops in the balance of power. And I think he would have urged American policy to focus more on trying to shape the political dynamics of the region rather than gear up for a militarized confrontation with China. And so I think that's a good opportunity to introduce Kennan's thinking into this mix.
That's wonderful. Well said.
My response is very brief. I think it's difficult for the structuralism to become a dynamic because the reality, the international configuration or the power structure has changed from the Cold War and the bipolar and then the unipolar after Cold War, and then now no matter what, someone's bipolar, someone's multipolar, no matter what. And then through this change, the general peace of the world maintained. That means the change of the power structure is relevant with the general peace. And the second, and the change of all of these power structures, this didn't bring what the theory predicted and they make the security situation different. Actually, you find that the proxy war continues, just more or less. There's a change of in degree, not in totally in nature. So I think it's difficult for the structural realism to become a dynamic mainly because the nuclear weapons maintain the nuclear deterrence strategy, maintain the general peace, make in the domain of the security is quite similar for all the three periods. So that's why I think it's difficult for the structural realists to adjust their theory to the reality.
Thank you. And since we are at time now, I just wanted to thank all of you. Just heartfelt thanks for your participation, for the great questions, to Professor Kirshner for laying out your own positions, for then in the end, really managing to, get some synthesis, thanks to Jack Snyder, who said that he ended up agreeing with a lot of what Professor Kirshner was saying. I wanted to thank the School for International Studies and the Institute for International Strategy Studies at Peking University for hosting this event. This was wonderful, Professor Yu. Thanks so much for your brilliant questions, and we hope to continue. And you brought up also the point of translation and how important it is to translate each other's work. So you've translated Professor Snyder's work. We have translated Professor Yan-Zhe Tong's work and hope to translate other works from Chinese scholars. So we in the hear more about opinions and theories in our, but everywhere else also. So I'm delighted about this event, and I thank you everybody, and thanks also to the audience for being so multitudinous in attendance, and I hope you have a great rest of your day, and thanks again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Brigitte. Jack, thank you. Johnson, 杨老师.
Yes, thank you all so much. It was a wonderful experience. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Learned a lot.
谢谢灵犀啊 ，Thank you so much， 灵犀。
Thank you, Lingxi. You're muted. You're muted.
谢谢于老师，谢谢杨老师。Okay, thank you everybody. Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Bye bye. Yeah, see you next time.
See you next time.
See you.
See you on Friday.